Hello, and welcome to When Music Meets Mindfulness. I'm your host, Vanya Chan. I am delighted to welcome our featured guest today, Lynn Helding, Professor of Practice in Voice and Vocal Pedagogy at the University of Southern California, Thornton School of Music. I'd like to take a moment to introduce you by touching on as many of your accomplishments as possible. A mezzo-soprano, Lynn's stage credits include leading roles with Harrisburg Opera, Nashville Opera, and Ohio Light Opera, and solo recitals throughout the U.S. and internationally. A devoted teacher, she was recognized as a legendary figure in the field of voice pedagogy by the Contemporary Commercial Music Vocal Pedagogy Institute at Shenandoah University, receiving their 2020 Lifetime Achievement Award, and is a member of the prestigious American Academy of Teachers of Singing. Lynn uses the term vocologist to designate her special training and qualifications. She works with a variety of vocalists on a myriad of vocal problems, and is a team member at the USC Voice Center, Keck Medicine of USC. Having proposed cognitive science as the third pillar of voice science, she is in demand as a presenter on cognitive topics, presenting at major voice conferences, symposia, and schools of music around the world. She's the author of The Musician's Mind, Teaching, Learning, and Performance in the Age of Brain Science, a book which I am a huge fan of, and I have my copy right here, which you can see is marked with the countless sticky tabs. So I have to thank you again, Lynn, for taking the time to sign my book for me when we first met
Yes,
at
we
the
met
uh,
in Toronto.
at
Yeah.
the International Congress of Voice Teachers last summer in Toronto. So Lynn, welcome and thank you for being here. How are you today?
Oh, I'm well, Vanya. Thank you. What a nice introduction. That was just, and I loved meeting you and seeing all the tabs on your book. So that was thrilling.
So let's dive into our first topic, which is calming the mind. In your book, as I just pointed out, The Musician's Mind, you have a chapter towards the end entitled The Digital Brain, where you cover a variety of crucial issues from multitasking to internet addiction. You quoted author Nicholas Carr from his book, The Shallows: What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains, stating that instead of diving deep into our brains, we zip along the surface like a guy on a jet ski, which I love that description because it's true.
Yeah.
So to counteract this digital overload, which is overwhelming our cognitive load capacity, what are some strategies or solutions that you utilize to help calm your mind, heighten awareness, and bring your focus to the present moment?
Wow, what a great question. I think I would start by saying knowledge is power, and I think it's really important for people to understand this world we are living in that some have dubbed the attention economy. Um, that we are in a new age. Certainly the digital age for sure, but also we're in this attentional age where human attention has become commodified and is actually quite valuable. So if you wonder about that, why is it? I just happened the other day, I was reading an article in the New York Times, I believe it was, and I didn't even mean to click on an ad for shoes. And the next thing, that brand of shoes turned up not only in ads for other things, but on in my email, which really freaked me out because that's the only way it could have gotten there, is that is through spyware. And as much as I'm pretty tech savvy, I've set all my settings for privacy settings when I'm on browsers, but there are so many workarounds now. And the point of all this is to say, oh, come on, attention, really? Yes, if attention was not that valuable, they wouldn't be trying to trace us, for everything that we buy and everything that we read and our opinions. This has become quite commodified. So before I really answer this question, I would say a couple of things. That chapter was, I wouldn't say it was the hardest of all 8 chapters of that book, but it was certainly the most depressing chapter to write. And I started research. So we are in 2026 officially now. I started research on that topic in 2010. And I remember that because I was on sabbatical that year. And it was even then, that was just beginning to have some information about what the digital overload was doing, not only to our brains, but very specifically to attention. So in the book, I did a deep dive on what learning really is, and I really wanted to make sure that I did this scientifically accurately, maybe the way a research journalist would look at it. I'm not a scientist, I'm not a psychologist, so I went at it like a very responsible researcher would go at it. And I really wanted to define what is learning anyway. And what I figured out and what is in the book is there are basically three phases. And again, one of the things we always have to say about the brain is that it's a fool's errand to try to reduce anything in the human brain to simplistic models. But we have to for teaching and learning purposes, or we wouldn't get our brains around it. So the human mind is recognized as the most complex entity in the known universe, which is staggering in itself. If we could reduce learning to three stages, it's pretty recognized. There's attention, there's learning itself, and then there's memory. So attention is what starts to happen, the learning process. While we're learning, that's also called short-term memory. It can go in quickly, but it can leave just as quickly unless we mark it or do something to that learning to deposit it into our memory banks where we can go get it later. That's kind of the overview. When I finally had that all figured out, and then I was studying each one of those aspects discretely, I learned pretty quickly that attention is a huge topic in and of itself. It has its own journal. uh, there's now a phase of attention that's been identified as pre-attentional phase. So what do we make of that? Attention is pretty darned important. If we can't pay attention, which is a wonderful construct that we have in our language, which is pretty accurate, right? That pay as in you have a fund, you withdraw from it. We might then surmise from that that it's valuable. We might also surmise from that that it's fragile. And both of those things are true, incredibly true. And this is part of our understanding of human memory, is how fallible memory is, in part because our attention is so easily hijacked. And in fact, that's what the attention economy is all about. It's putting brains onto how best to capture humans' attention and keep it. So we have these new words that have entered the lexicon in this century: doom scrolling, right? And this is the inability, or well, it's not an inability, but it is definitely hiking into our dopamine circuits to try to keep us scrolling and scrolling and scrolling. And this doom scrolling idea is when people get off of that, they realize, oh my gosh, I've been sitting on the sofa for 2 hours looking at cat videos. And most people describe a feeling very similar to what happens when you eat junk food or you binge on chocolates or you do something you know you shouldn't do. You just wait, you kind of go, I've got to get out of here and go for a walk. And you don't feel good. You feel kind of befuddled. Your circuits feel a little bit junky. I think to answer your question, what are some things that we can do to counteract? I think we have to start with education of ourselves, not of other people necessarily, but of ourselves. And I think we're starting to see, this in play. I see it with young parents, the way that they've now tamped down on their children's use of screens. Um, I see it in my own students' self-monitoring and behavior. So I'm a little bit hopeful. I think people are starting to realize, for all the reasons we've already talked about, lack of attention ability has eroded. When I do it for too much, I feel kind of icky physically. I feel icky in my soul. I haven't gotten as much done as I wanted to. So there are things that people can put into place. And I actually talk about this in my studio and in my classes that I teach. And there are things that teachers can do. So It starts with us, I must say, though, right? So we can talk about all these things, but before I do that, here's my phone. Turn your own phone off when you're teaching. I'm just, this to me it should go without saying, but I've had experiences where I've seen it doesn't go without saying. And I'm shocked when people not only let their phone go off in the middle of a coaching or a lesson, but will actually take it. Um, so it has to start with us. But I think we have to think about it in terms of the personal. So that would be what I just talked about, like how we interrelate with each other. The professional. So one of the things that we know is that when people are using these devices while they are trying to work, there's something that's been studied. It's in my book in the literature called task switch cost. And the social psychologist responsible for that is named Gloria Mark. She's the one who really figured out this idea that if you're working at a task, so let's say that you're in the practice room working, and you're focused, your attention is there, and all of a sudden your phone goes off. Your attention has already been hijacked. Whether you take the call or not, whether you look at the text or not, it's already been stolen because you've set up a little, oh, should I look at that message or should I keep doing what I was doing? You're already in trouble. And most people cannot resist. They will soon, like within a minute, they're going to look, right? Because we all have that idea. What if something terrible's happening? And of course, 99.9% of the time, it's nothing. It's nothing that was as important as what you were doing. Unless, like I said, if you really are an emergency responder, and that's part of your job, or you're in a situation in your life in which something really dangerous, difficult is happening. But most of the time that's not what it is. And even if it's from a friend, what's up? That's what my undergrads would get. What's up? What are you doing for lunch? That can wait. So we have to learn how to put in our own self-controls, which is turn the phone off. And I teach my students this. You can't just put it on, buzz mode because the cognitive hijacking will happen and you will look and you will start to think about, oh yeah, I'm going to meet them for lunch, and you'll answer it. And then this is what Gloria Mark figured out. What happened between that last moment that you were actually focusing and concentrating on your practice to where when you return? How many minutes elapse from that moment to the time where you get back and you're at the same level of attention? And she figured it's about 7 minutes. If you allow yourself to be interrupted 6 times in an hour, 6 times 7 is 42, you are at 75 minutes practice time, right? That's been interrupted. And then I got interested in, okay, well then what about that? That's not where it stops. So what about that 75 minutes percent time, or let's take the whole hour? What happens when you in that task switch moment? And what happens is you don't go back to the same level of learning. You actually go back to a slightly degraded level of learning. So if you do, hyper focus, a little bit less, 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 right? And on top of that, I got very interested in what that might mean for motor learning because that's what we're doing, really. And what I learned was that the place in the brain that stores motor memories, that is the memory of how to do something, versus other kinds of memories, is different. And it's that part of our storage system is very vulnerable to misfiling. Like you can literally put that memory in the wrong place. I also got interested in the aspect of motor learning that involves unlearning, right? So especially if we're trying to create a new habit, often with singers, we're trying to supersede a previous habit that maybe wasn't serving us. In other words, a bad habit. And the chances of that in singing are quite high because we're using biological processes of breathing and swallowing and phonating to hijack that, right? To go on to that top of that and sing. So what does all that mean? It means that we have to think about systems that we can put in place that will guard against these interruptions. So I start with educate yourself, be a good model yourself, teach your students that it's not their fault. There have been billions of dollars dedicated to understanding how to hijack human attention. And it's gotten quite sophisticated in this century because of the brain research. I think we have to be humbled by what we're up against. And it's like if you go on a diet, you don't buy the chips and the soda and the cookies. You just don't buy them. They're just not around so that you're tempted. So same thing, we have to learn how to turn our devices off. I always like right now when I'm talking to you, mine's off and it's down, it's face down. So I think those like self-control things, all other things we know that work, that I'm very fond of is something called art, which is why I like it. Attention restoration theory, which is that, again, that very, how do we heal our damaged attentional systems, and how do we try to clear them out and bring them back to some kind of stasis, some kind of human place. That's another thing too. When I mentioned the billion-dollar industry, we have to also realize that our technologies are overwhelming our natural human tendencies. So it's up to us to create, right, those those places that are safe, I guess, from our devices. So we know that walking in nature, they say. So not in a cityscape, not where you have to be worried, looking, thinking about crossing a street. Walk where you're really free to just walk. And I do it every day. Every day I walk. And yes, I'm fortunate. I live in a decent neighborhood where I can do that. But in times when I don't, or times when I haven't, and there have been many of those, I've made sure I get there. I love to, my husband and I hike a couple times a week in a nature preserve. So that's completely off grid. I never take my phone, ever. I worry that so many people now don't know what it feels like to be quiet or, God forbid, to be bored, right? So we have to have a podcast in our ears. I love podcasts. I love them. I listen to podcasts when I'm cooking because I'm doing something, I'm busy, but I often don't. Sometimes I'm like, you know what? I just want to give my brain a rest. I'm going to go out and garden. I'm going to vacuum the living room. Some of those things, those little mundane tasks, those are also ways for people to really center themselves. I'm more interested in how we interface with our normal, regular world. So I think it really starts with those controls of our devices, which are amazing and wonderful things. But there is a billion-dollar industry out there just wanting us to spend our entire waking hours on these things, and we are the ones that are going to have to put those controls in place, I would say, for ourselves and for those that we care about. If you take a room full of singers, especially younger singers in training, who are serious. I teach at a serious conservatory, so they're all assuming this is what they're going to do. And I say, think about this for 1 minute. You are basing your entire career on the attention of other humans. You are presupposing, right? You're assuming that all this training is going to lead up to a performance in which 1 to 500 people will go into a darkened concert hall or auditorium. They will sit down, they will be quiet, and they will pay attention to only what's on stage for an hour to 3 hours. That is a huge lift. It always has been for humans, but now with these attention hijackers, are you kidding me? So that's another aspect of this, is just understanding that one of the most precious things we give to other people is our full and undivided attention.
Yeah.
Right? And so
Yes.
that's something I think we can talk a lot more about, or should talk a lot more about, as artists, especially musicians, because we're in the realm of oral communication. It
Hmm.
goes out, and if you're not paying attention, it dies. It's an art that exists in time, and
Yeah.
when it's done, it's done,
It's so
right?
transient. It just comes and
Yeah.
goes. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's a long answer to your question, but I think it's got to start with understanding on a cognitive level the hijacking nature of these devices and doing everything in your power to set parameters for yourselves and everybody you care about. And then, oh yeah, why? Why do I care? That's a big one for my teaching. I ask my questions, that question all the time. Why do you
Hmm.
care about this? Why should we care? And sometimes you got to go all the way to these elemental things. Think about it. You're expecting 100 people your age, by the way, to come
Yes.
to your senior recital and sit down in a concert hall and pay complete attention to you and only you. That is an incredible privilege. It's also an incredible ask.
Yeah.
And if you can't do it yourself, how can you expect your friends to do it?
Yeah. When you think about the fact that as humans, we're supposed to train ourselves to do things from when we were walking at the earliest age. It was because we paid attention to what we were observing and started to absorb and learn in that way. If
Yeah.
now we sort of think somehow it's become so much more passive, as if I can just sit here and somehow by osmosis things will sink in and I'll be able to pull that up somehow later on down the road. But it is that attentional that intention to pay attention
Yes,
that is
exactly.
is at the kernel of all this, as you're pointing out. So
Well said. I love
yeah,
that. The intention to pay attention,
yeah,
which
yeah.
we have to safeguard. It's not coming naturally to us right now
Hmm.
because of the world we've built.
Well, actually, that's a great segue into our second topic, the idea of structure, the idea of organizing thoughts.
Yes.
So this kind of leads into your voice studio as well. You've been talking about your students, and in your book, you've highlighted Kay Anderson Erickson's deliberate practice, stating that practice that is organized, regular, and designed to be effortful has proved to be the most effective type of practice. So I'm
Right.
really fond of this paragraph from your book, which I believe succinctly outlines deliberate practice for both teachers and students. So I'll take a moment to just read this
Yeah,
quote now.
that's great. Do that.
Um, a deliberate practice regimen, as designed by the teacher and followed by the student, targets specific movements, notes successes, scrutinizes flaws, and, by analysis, continually redesigns the regimen. There is nothing vague about this type of practice. The requirements for the learner, an ability to work alone, to confront one's weaknesses, and to pay focused attention for a set amount of time each day, all highlights the fact that the kind of effort demanded of motor learners engaged in deliberate practice is not purely physical, but also requires building and accessing emotional and cognitive resources. So there's a lot to unpack in that quote, and you've sort of already been touching on it in the first topic, which is great. I guess for the purposes of helping to narrow down the topic, I'd like to focus on the need for that organization and specificity, that there's
Yes.
nothing vague about this type of practice. So with the understanding that regimens vary, and we were talking about that individuality and personalization, um, uh, so the regimens would be built around the uniqueness of each individual student. Could you share an example of a deliberate practice regimen that you would craft and guide a voice student through?
One of the most important things, and I have a great quote from Erickson, the requirement for effort sets deliberate practice apart from mindless routine repetition and playful engagement. The idea of effort is that it has to be something you're not good at, right? So, what is practicing that is not effortful? It's performance. You're just playing or singing the same old thing over and over again that you already sing or play really well. That's not practice. Now, that is not deliberate practice. It might be using your muscles and it might be some other things. But singing for joy and pleasure, yes, go do that. But if we're talking about true learning in a cognitive sense, there has to be some effort. So here's a nice thought. Practice what is difficult, not what is easy. That's a beautiful idea, right? It's so simple, but it does kind of get at the heart of his secondary clause, which is mindless routine performance or mindless routine going over things, or playful engagement, right? And so mindless routine would be playing the same thing over and over and over again that you already play really well. Playful engagement, if you're just kind of goofing around, let's say, goofing around on your instrument, noodling around on the keyboard, that has its benefit, but that's not what we're talking about, right? That's improv, that's playing for and singing for joy. Go do that. Yes. Does that have any place in my practice? Yes. Period. Full stop. Now, but back to deliberate practice, which is really the topic here. Practice what is difficult, not what is easy. You have to have a plan. That's my number one rule. And that goes in my syllabus. I have a whole thing on deliberate practice, what it is and what it isn't, right? You have to have a plan. The more specific, the better. That is well known in psychology, in the psychology of goal setting. So some of the things we know about goal setting, this is exactly the same thing for a practice plan. The more specific you are, the better. And when you have to get specific, one needs to get smaller, right? So what are my goals for this semester? I'm going to become a better singer. Whoa, right? That's way too global. I'm a tenor. I'm going to work on my high notes. Again, way too global. So you get, my A is really good. My B flat's still out of range. Okay, now we're getting close. We're getting to something more specific. Let's get even more specific, right? And the more advanced the learner, the more they can do that. They can tell you, I think I have my breath pressure figured out, but I still haven't figured quite how to get that B flat in the right pocket, right? I think it's too pressed and it's too muscular. I'm using too much muscle. I still need to figure out how to get more resonance. Okay, that's a realizable goal for the semester. We're going to work on that B flat so that it becomes more resonant and less pressed. Great, right? Each student has their own unique struggles and things, right? So we have to make sure that they know also what they are good at. I mean, that's the part that we don't want to leave out either. What, because I have advanced students. I work with professional singers too, and I have this year I had to take aside and say, you have to quit thinking about breath support. And he was like, why? And I said, because you've achieved it. You, and he was like, oh. I said, you need to check that box. In fact, let's make a list of the things that you really do well now. Da 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 da. Can you please check that box and move on? Because we need to focus in your practice on the things that are still hard for you. So that's part of how you set up a routine. Of course, I have specific things I want my students to do every day, because I also take some models from ballet. I danced when I was young, a lot younger, but I loved the structure of that. I loved the repetitive movements. You know, Tai Chi has repetitive movements, yoga has repetitive movements, and they can offer us kind of a standard and a guideline, and you always kind of know, especially as you get to know your body within those systems, whether you're slot on, you're a little off, you're a little over, you're a little under. It helps to have a baseline, I think. So I do have exercises that everybody has to do every day, even if they've mastered them. So that's part one. Part two would be then, what are the specific things? So we go back to our tenor that's got a great A and the B flat's not. So we're going to be very specific about the exact exercises that are going to target that. So what's the difference between just brute phonation and actually being primed to sing? Well, we are doing, this is back to the Erickson's definition of deliberate practice, right? It's specific protocols designed to improve a specific aspect of your performance. That's what deliberate practice really means. So It is the opposite of running over your music. It is, which I have a great frame that shows roadkill, right? That's what I think of when somebody says I ran over my piece. I'm like, that, that's not practice, right? And it also, we know that mindless routine kind of singing will sometimes sink bad habits in even further. If you're in a phase where you're breaking things apart, you're taking them down, you have to pay extra careful attention. We know this from motor learning studies because things can go awry pretty quickly. So you have to make sure while you're in this icky, messy phase of everything's out on the table and I don't really know what to do anymore. I'm learning this new technique, especially when the old technique starts to degrade. This is really interesting. So let's say I'm going to take an example of a student that I had a while ago who had a very aggressive breathing technique, um, too aggressive, right? And the sound that was produced was also very heavy, I would say, and sort of overblown. And so as we worked together, this student began to understand that it was as if the motor, the motor that was driving everything, was overpowering up top, right? And so we had to work on both because the sound, of course, people take voice lessons because they want to sound better. And so we wanted the sound to be more resonance based. I teach opera singers, so more resonance based, less forceful, less pushed and shoved. Intonation problems because of that. But we had to start with the motor and stop overblowing. So it was this constant toggling between these two systems that had to learn how to work together. Once he got a little better at the resonance piece, he was still pumping that um, respiration system really hard, right? And so it was the kind of understanding, oh, I have to do that less. And I remember thinking, you have to, and I said to him, you have to really pay attention in your practice because that is such an old habit in you to go, right? And now that you've got things a little bit lighter up top, you're still shoving and pushing below. And it's an old motor memory that just wants to hang in there. And it's probably hanging in there not because you're necessarily feeding it, but because you haven't done the opposite. You haven't turned your back on it and allowed it to wither away. Because sometimes you just mindlessly do it, it's hanging in there. So what we know about motor memories is that one of the ways that I've been really interested in this idea of unlearning is we don't go after it. We actually go after the new thing that we want to do. And by ignoring the old habit, it goes away. But that doesn't mean we just set our clocks and hope for the best, right? It means that you have to pay almost like hyper attention in deliberate practice when you're learning a new technique. And so that's part of the deliberate practice plan. The other part that I want to make sure I say that's really important, super important, and it comes straight to us from motor learning. The everydayness of deliberate practice is the most important thing. It is way more important than the amount of time you spend. So we do simple math and you say, like, if you practice an hour a day, over 6 days, get one day off a week, that's 6 hours, right? You will get somewhere. But if you take that same 6 hours and you do three on Saturday and three on Sunday because, oh my God, my lesson's on Monday, there's really good evidence that not only will you not get anywhere, but this is critical, you'll probably end up worse off because you've hitched your wagon to this new technique, right? You're going to work on that. But the old technique is still there. And if you don't really go about working on installing the new one daily, 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 so that the old one fades away, the old one will just hang in there. And I've seen this happen when people think it's my new teacher, it's not working for me. Well, you're not practicing enough. I'm practicing hours a day. Yeah, but you're not practicing deliberately on a daily and regular basis with a plan. So back to human attention. We can't pay attention for very long. That's just something we have to understand. So I give people protocols and I will tell them if it's something they really need to dislodge, like tongue tension is really tricky. Can you focus for 3 minutes a day? And they'll go, well, of course I can. Great. I want you to do this exercise for 3 minutes, 3 times a day. Really? Yep. Because it's, and well, why? Well, because it's really boring. Because you're going to go, ay, 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 ay. You're going to do that like up and down in one octave. It's going to take you 3 minutes to do that. If you insist on doing it more, your mind's going to start to wander, and all of a sudden we're going to get, you're going to go right back to where you were. So you have to hyper focus for 3 minutes, 3 times a day, and I promise you, if you can do that, this motor memory will start to be installed. So it's that specific, you know? And I like to kind of give singers good news. Like the dirty little secret for us is you don't have to practice for hours and hours and hours a day. You just don't. If you practice deliberately with extreme specificity and a plan, you're going to see results. And you can do this an hour a day, 6 days a week. Now, you got to do more if you're on a professional track. You're going to do less if you're 16, right? So I think that deliberate practice is such a fascinating topic. And it involves a lot of different aspects. I'm writing a second book, and that's going to be a big part of it. It's just sort of the different recipes, you know, for how that gets put together and what different tools we can use. But I find that my students, I think, have really taken to it, and the proof's in the pudding because they improve. They also journal so that when they're not singing, right? And the journal has to be very specific as well. You know, don't just tell me you practice. Tell me how did it go? What are you thinking about? What happened in that practice room? What are you noticing? You know?
Yeah, no, all of that is wonderful because it really, just the examples you gave, really highlights how you have to practice being able to isolate the specifics so that just with the tenor example that you gave, as he was able to whittle it down to a really narrow focus, not only were you tackling the right, like the very specific task, but it made it less overwhelming, as you said, because now you've got it's within your manageable ability and not overdoing it either, just giving yourself like
No.
3 times, that's it, setting a limit. And again, that's sort of putting up those structures to protect ourselves, to keep ourselves from overwhelming ourselves, which is the easiest thing to do in more ways than one, as we've said.
Yes,
Yeah.
it is. I find that it's been a really important part of my practice to help them understand that the dailiness trumps everything. And even on days when all they can manage is 20 minutes, I want to convince them that 20 minutes is not just better than nothing. That's just anybody can say that. But that the research is pretty clear about the dailiness, right? And it's not, even if they're not, they don't feel they're accomplish anything physically, cognitively, it's a gold mine. And if you do something enough times, your brain recognizes that it's important and it will remember it. So that's why practicing every day is so much more beneficial than we even knew because your brain's going literally, what is it with that? You know, you're singing that same, that high B flat that keeps appearing. And every time you do, you know, the whole system is doing the same thing over and over and over and over. It must be important. Let's mark that as important. We're going to put that in the important file, right? And so whether we know it or not, it's just subtly building on itself over and over. And this is why people will report things like, I used to memorize my whole recital programs that way. You know, I would just, I didn't get great sleep, gotta admit it, but I would wake up in the morning with a lot more remembered.
It's like deepening the grooves somehow by that
Yeah.
repetition, by saying that this is important and telling ourselves, telling our bodies, telling our minds that we want to do this and giving it time. There's no cramming at all. This has to be done
No,
over
cramming doesn't
time.
work. Yeah.
Cramming does not work, yeah.
Mm.
I don't want to take too much more of your time, but I would like to touch on the third topic,
Yeah,
the state of flow.
let's do it.
Let's do it. But just starting with Mihai Csikszentmihalyi
Mhm.
has described the state of flow as the optimal state of inner experience in which there is order in consciousness, and this happens when psychic energy or attention is invested in realistic goals and when skills match the opportunities for action. So, according to this description, one could surmise, and we've sort of touched on this already, that consistent investment in a deliberate practice regimen would lead to a level of preparation that would increase the performer's chances of experiencing that optimal flow state. So, based on your own personal experience as a performer and on your observations as a teacher guiding your voice students, would you say that there is that direct connection between preparation through deliberate practice and then experiencing that state of flow in performance?
How we connect it to deliberate practice, I think you're spot on there. So instead of us, but I guess I'm always looking at teaching and I'm looking at real world, and I think chasing this idea of I want to get to this optimal state where everything else falls away and all I can think about is my thing, I don't think the evidence tells us actually that that's what happens for a performer. And let's talk about singing because that's what we are, involves other people, right? It involves deep community and so I think to be chasing some place where you go where everything falls away might not speak to us the way it ought to. Secondly, there's been a huge shift in this is probably this second most important point I'll make. There's been a huge shift in our understanding of that kind of attention. And it's in my book, and I'm going to clarify it a lot more in my second one. It's called Attentional Focus Theory. And you can look that up because it's in there. The the huge players in that, led by somebody named Gabrielle Wolf, have been preaching for decades about this idea of like getting out of your own way. It's kind of a version of go with the flow. Get out of your own way, get out of your own head, and you will be able to slot into this flow place where everything else will fall away and you will run your processes automatically. That there's this automatic nirvana where suddenly all figure skating, all dart throwing, all windsurfing, all singing, all piano playing, anything that's in the motor realm becomes completely automatic and we achieve this kind of nirvana state. And there's been a counter argument to that. There isn't any such thing as effortless attention. That it's actually its polar opposite. It is effortful attention. And effortful attention has been achieved through, guess what? You made that connection, right? Deliberate practice, right?
Yeah.
But that the goal is not to deliberate practice so much that all of your systems run automatically. That instead, that you have a heightened sense of awareness and you are so in control of your skill that you can, when we deliberate practice, we build chunks. So chunking is huge in cognitive theory. And it's like Lego blocks. You've got these Lego blocks lying all around you in a performance, and you can pick them up and put them together at your will because you're so skilled, right? And I will say, like, sometimes I talk about downhill skiing. Downhill skiers are famous for, they go up to the top of the run. Of course, they go down it, but they're looking at their snow. They're reading the weather report. They have, I'm sure, several pairs of skis. They have coaches. They're always like having to change their technique because of the conditions. We do that too, right? Singers do that too. We are going to go into a different hall. We may have a different collaborators. So we have partners, right? If you've ever had to sing for somebody who got sick, terrifying, but there you are, and you've got to slot in with all the other members of the ensemble. You got to, so your skill, that to me, again, it's you're not like zoning out and getting into a place where you're ignoring. You're actually heightened aware, effortful. You're paying attention to a lot of different things, and you're telling yourself, "I can do this." I've deliberate practice so much. I can pick things up, I can move things around. But that's the opposite of get out of my own way, just go with the flow. It's on that bed, like you said, it's totally tied to deliberate practice. Without that, this conversation can't happen. But once we have that, then what we're doing is we're re, uh, Erickson calls it retrieving reliable retrieval structures. building building reliable retrieval structures, meaning when I go to grab that high note, I know where it's going to be. I know exactly where it is. I know exactly how it feels. I know exactly. I don't have to think about it anymore. But if it's a really, really touchy situation, I may have to give it my effortful attention for a second. Other things I'm going to check the box on. Other stuff that's low hanging fruit, not so much. But there might be a really critical moment where I'm going to have to really pay attention. I'm really have to think for that second, right? But if you do your practice snacking and you do your every day, not three, not mega practice, you can know when you go into performance, you've done everything you can to create those reliable retrieval structures. And just having success with that one time for some people is, it opens a whole world of possibility.
What people tend to fall back on, which is this passiveness, which is this idea of you get to a point where you don't have to think or where it gets easy all the time. And that's not true at all. Like there's
No.
like the concept of flow, and I think what most people understand it as is that ease and effortlessness. But there is always, the duck's feet still paddling under the water. It's still it's different in the sense that, as you said, that retrieval, it's like the skill sets are so finely tuned that you're able to walk into a situation, spontaneously read what's going on, and rise to the challenge of each possible obstacle course that could possibly come up, and be able to succeed and in that way grow in complexity and in your confidence ability, in your abilities, and kind of
Right.
continue from there. But there is always that engagement. There's never that checking out. And even just going back to what you mentioned, where you were telling a student to check off the boxes that he's already good at, just the having that knowledge in the back of your mind that
Yes.
I this part is automatic, in the sense that I've done the deliberate practice, that's done. Now I can put my attention on the things that are unexpected, that I really need to be able to call on what I've worked on to come to the forefront and help me out in this
Yeah.
situation, right? So
Yes.
yeah, yeah.
And as I often like to end all of these things by saying, don't forget art. I have a
Yes.
little picture of a beautiful dog, like he's your best friend dog, sitting there patiently. Don't forget art. That's what we can pay our attention to, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So we're
Yeah.
not we're not running on automatic pilot so much as we're checking the box and saying, I did I learned these things. I keep them in shape by
Hmm.
deliberate practicing every day because there
Hmm.
are certain fundamentals like the ballet class.
Hmm.
I have to do these things every day.
Hmm.
But eventually we have that space left over to not get out of our own way, to not get out of our own head, but to devote it to communication and
Yes.
art, right? And
Yeah.
and being emotional. That's the freeing part, I
Yeah.
think.
Yeah, yeah. That's what pulled us into this field in the first place. It's just that
Yeah.
connection with other human beings, of telling stories, of that relatability, because of the beauty that has been put together in a particular piece of music or opera, or the way the performer themselves expresses their emotions through music. That's what grabs our attention first. The big question, as you said, you ask your students all the time, why are
Yeah.
they doing this? At the core of it is really to get to that point where we can express ourselves with abandon, with connection. Yeah,
Yeah, with
yeah,
abandon. I love that. That's a
yeah.
great word.
Thank you again, Lynn, for coming on the series to share your wisdom, your research, and your experiences. It was an honor to have you here because, as you know, I'm a big fan of you and your work. So, thank you for your ongoing contribution to voice science and vocal pedagogy. And I will continue to follow your research and to learn from you. So, Thank you. Tonight was
Wonderful.
wonderful experience for me, so I appreciate it. And to our audience, thank you for tuning in. See you next time on When Music Meets Mindfulness.